welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get rolling today, I'm actually going to ask you for a very quick favor. Please take just 1 second to like and subscribe to the channel.
It really is the single best way to help us out.
Yeah, exactly. It helps us continue bringing you these incredibly thorough, unvarnished explorations of, the most fascinating and heavily debated materials out there. And today we are embarking on a massive, really incisive mission.
Massive is the right word.
Right. We are executing a comprehensive review of an incredibly provocative, highly requested ebook. It is titled Masculine Enlightenment: Fear, Desire, and Spiritual Awakening by Conrad Riker.
And just a quick note for everyone. If you find the ideas in this deep dive compelling, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook for yourself.
Definitely. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. Now, I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment. We know exactly why you requested this specific text. You are deeply interested in the history of our institutions.
You want to understand how they functioned before they were...
Before they were fundamentally captured.
Right.
Right. According to the arguments we'll be exploring today, captured by modern feminist and Marxist ideologies.
You're interested in the perspective of men's rights advocates, the red-pilled manosphere?
Yeah, you want a thorough look at the frameworks arguing that modern society isn't just incidentally difficult for men, but is actively structured to work against traditional masculinity. Well, you are in the right place. We are going to unpack this exact framework in extensive, relentless detail today.
But before we open Chapter 1, we really do need to establish the parameters for how we are approaching this text.
Ground rules.
Exactly. This ebook contains highly politically charged content. It constructs a very heavy critique of left-wing ideologies, the modern feminist movement, and what the author categorizes as cultural Marxism.
Very heavy critiques.
Yeah. So because of the nature of this material, it is crucial to state explicitly that we, as your guides through this material, are not taking sides.
Not at all.
Our function today is not to endorse the viewpoints presented in the book, nor is it to condemn or validate them.
We are just the messengers.
Right. Our job is to impartially report, deconstruct, and analyze Riker's arguments in extreme depth. The goal is to ensure you fully understand the mechanical, historical, and philosophical ideas contained within this source material.
So you can examine the framework critically and draw your own informed conclusions.
Precisely.
All right, let's jump right into the deep end. Riker, he doesn't waste any time setting the stage. Right in the first chapter, he introduces his foundational premise, which is that the modern man is living through a historical existential crisis.
He characterizes it as a literal war on masculinity.
A literal war. He argues that massive societal shifts have intentionally eroded traditional male roles, and he specifically points the finger at the rise of cultural Marxism.
And we should probably define how he's using that term, because it gets thrown around a lot online.
Yeah, please do.
So in Riker's framework, cultural Marxism is the application of Marxist power dynamics.
The oppressor versus the oppressed.
Right. But shifted away from economics and applied directly to cultural categories like gender and race. He argues this framework inherently casts traditional masculinity in the role of the oppressor, which leaves modern men in a vacuum of confusion.
And he articulates the mechanism of this crisis through a psychological concept, right? He calls it the double bind.
Yes, the double bind. This occurs when a person is subjected to two conflicting, mutually exclusive demands, making successful navigation completely impossible.
You are punished regardless of which path you choose.
Exactly.
Give me a real-world scenario of how he says this plays out for a guy right now, like on the ground.
Okay, think about the cultural messaging around emotional availability. Society constantly demands that modern men be vulnerable, that they open up and, get in touch with their feelings.
We hear that constantly.
But Riker argues that the moment a man actually does this, the moment he shows genuine fear, hesitation, or weakness, he is subconsciously or even overtly penalized for it by his partner or his peers.
They lose respect for him.
They do. And conversely, the other side of the bind is that society still implicitly demands men be strong, protective, and capable rocks in a crisis.
But when a man exhibits that traditional, stoic, decisive masculine strength,
he is immediately demonized by the broader culture as being domineering, oppressive, or toxic.
it's a literal catch-22. If you open up, you're weak. If you take charge, toxic.
And the psychological toll of that is profound. Riker argues this double bind completely paralyzes men. It traps them in a state of perpetual self-doubt and inaction.
Because if every behavioral choice is going to be culturally penalized, The safest option seems to be doing nothing at all.
which leads to the exact apathy and withdrawal we see in so many young men today.
That is fascinating. And that actually brings us to the baseline of how Riker views human nature as a whole. He completely rejects the blank slate theory.
Entirely.
For anyone unfamiliar, the blank slate theory, or tabula rasa, is the idea that humans are born with no innate traits and that all behavioral differences between men and women are just the result of how society socializes us from birth.
Which Riker says is a dangerous fiction. He argues that the differences are biological facts etched deeply into our DNA.
He leans very heavily into biological determinism to make this case.
He does. The book highlights specific endocrinological data. For instance, he notes the role of testosterone, the primary hormone driving aggression, competitiveness, risk-taking, and ambition.
And he points out that this hormone is present in men at levels 7 to 8 times higher than in women.
Right. And for Riker, this is not some arbitrary byproduct of a patriarchal culture. It is the fundamental, inescapable biological engine of male behavior.
And he frames this all through evolutionary psychology, the idea that we spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to very specific survival pressures.
The evolutionary context is the bedrock of his argument here. Over millions of years of human evolution, men were subjected to selective pressures that required them to protect the tribe and provide resources.
Which necessitates risk-taking and physical strength.
And status-seeking behaviors, because historically, higher status meant better access to mates and resources.
While women, conversely, evolved under pressures that required them to nurture offspring and sustain the community's social fabric.
Which selects heavily for empathy, caution, and cooperation. So Riker's core argument here is that attempting to deny or engineer away these deeply ingrained evolutionary differences in the name of modern equality is biologically disastrous.
Because it forces men to act against their own neurochemistry.
Exactly.
That is a massive foundational claim. If we accept that this biological baseline exists, it naturally makes you wonder how men historically fit into society before the cultural shifts of the last century took place.
How we harness that biology instead of fighting it.
Right. And Riker provides a historical timeline to explain this, walking us through the archetypes of male institutions before they were captured. So let's start where he starts, with the hunter-gatherer era.
In the hunter-gatherer context, the stakes were absolute. There was no social safety net.
Zero margin for error.
Riker points out that traits like physical strength, courage in the face of danger, and decisive, unquestioned leadership weren't just admirable personality quirks. They were strict, non-negotiable survival necessities.
Men were required to hunt large, dangerous game and protect their specific tribe from predators and competing groups of humans.
And the key concept he focuses on here is consequence.
The concept of consequence is vital to understanding the male psyche, according to the text.
It is. If a man failed in his duties during that era, the consequences were harsh, immediate, and often fatal. He would face the wrath of the unforgiving natural environment, or he would be ostracized by his peers.
The entire tribe's survival depended on masculine competence. Men were forged by the pressure of knowing that their failure meant the death of their loved ones.
So fast forward a bit. Let's shift the timeline, because the Industrial Revolution is where Riker sees a massive fracture.
I found this part of the analysis really striking because it shifts the blame away from a modern culture war and looks at an economic shift that happened a couple of centuries ago. He views the Industrial Revolution as a profound psychological dislocation for men.
It was the death of the craftsman.
Yeah.
Before the widespread mechanization of the Industrial Revolution, a man was generally a master of a specific domain. Whether he was a blacksmith forging tools, a farmer working a plot of land, or a carpenter building a home, he saw the tangible physical fruits of his labor from start to finish.
He had absolute autonomy.
Riker argues that the transition to factory work fundamentally altered the male sense of self. It turned men into anonymous, replaceable cogs in a massive industrial machine.
Just think about the guy who used to spend days crafting a piece of furniture with his own hands. His name was attached to the quality of that work. Now put that same guy on an assembly line where his entire existence is just turning one specific wrench on a machine for 14 hours a day.
The pride of craftsmanship was systematically eroded. Men were no longer creating something of their own. They were disconnected from the final product.
Which Riker argues fundamentally severed men from their innate sense of self-worth and purpose.
They were reduced from creators and masters of their environment to mere laborers selling their time to survive.
So to counterbalance that loss of purpose, or perhaps to guide the male drive throughout history before that, Riker points to the historical role of religion and honor codes.
Right, we're talking about the Ten Commandments, the chivalric codes of the medieval knights, the samurai's code of Bushido.
These weren't just arbitrary rules. Riker says these frameworks were designed to channel male aggression.
They were necessary guardrails. These spiritual and martial leaders understood that male aggression and strength were incredibly potent forces. Left unchecked, they lead to absolute chaos.
But channeled correctly, they build civilizations.
Exactly. These rigorous moral standards framed men as protectors and, importantly, as the moral compasses of their communities. They demanded internal integrity.
A knight wasn't just a killer, he was sworn to protect the weak.
The samurai was bound by absolute loyalty and honor. These codes provided a socially beneficial avenue for the biological urge to dominate and conquer.
Which perfectly explains why Riker views war and exploration as the ultimate crucibles of masculinity.
Yes, from ancient battlefields to the Apollo moon landings, he argues that extreme conflict and the push into the absolute unknown strip away the comfortable veneer of civilization.
War and exploration are where the theoretical meets the undeniable. These extreme environments test a man's courage in ways a modern office job never could.
They forge unbreakable brotherhoods because your life literally depends on the man next to you. War, in its idealized historical context, requires ultimate sacrifice for a greater cause.
And exploration requires the ingenuity and bravery to face the void.
So the overarching takeaway Riker wants the reader to grasp from these historical archetypes is that male dominance and the instinct to build institutions are not rooted in some malicious desire to oppress women or minorities.
Right. He argues that the male drive is about creating enduring systems that defy mortality. Look at the pyramids of Egypt, the aqueducts of Rome, the skyscrapers of New York.
Men built these monumental structures driven by a fundamental biological urge to leave a lasting mark, to impose order on a chaotic world, and to build something that outlasts their own brief lives.
He uses this historical record to validate the male instinct to build, protect, and lead as a fundamentally positive, constructive force that literally built the modern world.
But if that was the glorious past, the present is a much darker picture in this text.
Yeah, we move into Riker's critique of contemporary culture. He bluntly describes the modern world as a minefield specifically designed, intentionally or not, to weaken masculinity at every turn.
Let's walk through the specific cultural traps he identifies.
He starts with pornography, which he refers to as a digital drug.
He treats it as a profound public health crisis for men. The book links the excessive consumption of high-speed internet pornography to a host of devastating issues.
Neurologically, it acts as a supernormal stimulus.
It floods the male brain with dopamine at levels that evolutionary history never prepared us for, which leads to the downregulation of dopamine receptors.
So it's literally numbing their brains to normal, everyday rewards.
Precisely. And behaviorally, it creates wildly unrealistic expectations regarding sex and physical intimacy, which directly correlates to decreased relationship satisfaction in reality.
Not to mention skyrocketing rates of physiological issues like pornography-induced erectile dysfunction in incredibly young men.
Riker frames porn as a pacifier. It is a tool that numbs the mind, erodes the soul, and ultimately siphons off the masculine drive.
The ambition, the aggression, and the energy that historically would have been directed toward finding a mate, building a family, and conquering the physical world
Is instead being wasted in front of a glowing screen.
The next trap he identifies is modern schooling. And I know this is a massive point of friction for a lot of parents today. Riker claims that the modern education system actively penalizes natural masculine traits from the moment boys enter kindergarten.
Just look at the framework of the modern classroom. Riker argues that schools have been deliberately structured to reward conformity, passivity, and compliance.
The expectation is that a 7-year-old boy should be able to sit perfectly still at a desk for 8 hours, be quiet, and follow rigid bureaucratic rules.
Which goes completely against the biological baseline we discussed earlier.
Completely. Traits that come naturally to boys: competitiveness, physical energy, assertiveness, a desire for rough and tumble play, and risk-taking are no longer seen as normal developmental stages.
Instead, they are frequently diagnosed as behavioral disorders. Boys are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and heavily medicated simply for acting like boys.
The implication Riker draws is that we are conditioning males to view their own biology as a disease from a very young age, leaving them completely ill-equipped for the realities of manhood.
Add to that the economic and technological shifts. We talked about the psychological dislocation of the Industrial Revolution, but today we have the gig economy and massive job insecurity.
The fundamental role of the provider is constantly under threat. You can be laid off via an algorithm.
and technology is constantly fragmenting attention. But perhaps the most controversial cultural trap Riker identifies is the combination of identity politics and consumerism.
In Riker's framework, identity politics is a calculated tool of division. He believes it artificially pits men against each other based on race, class, sexual orientation, or other demographic categories.
By forcing men to view each other primarily through the lens of historical grievance and intersectional hierarchy, it destroys the potential for male unity.
It prevents the kind of brotherhood that historically allowed men to build those enduring institutions.
And while identity politics divides them, consumerism distracts them. Consumerism preys on the innate male desire for status.
Historically, a man gained status by what he built, how bravely he fought, or how well he protected his community.
But consumerism replaces the pursuit of meaningful, legacy-building goals with the hollow, relentless pursuit of material goods.
Men are taught by corporate marketing to measure their worth by the brand of their watch or the car they lease, rather than by their character or competence.
So if a man recognizes that he is standing in the middle of this cultural minefield, numbed by porn, penalized by schools, threatened economically, divided by politics, and distracted by consumerism, what is the antidote?
How does Riker say a man actually navigates this without self-destructing?
He says it starts with a brutal rejection of the victim mentality. You have to take radical responsibility for your own life.
No one is coming to save you. The government isn't coming to save you.
You must develop critical thinking to cut through the modern noise and build extreme emotional and physical resilience to bounce back from the setbacks this landscape will inevitably throw at you.
This brings us to a crucial pivot in the text. To take that level of radical responsibility, Riker says a man cannot just look at the external culture. He must first look inward.
In Chapter 2, he details the 4 primary fears that men must confront to achieve what he calls a spiritual awakening.
He argues that if you don't conquer these internal fears, all the external tactics in the world won't matter. You will remain trapped.
Let's really explore these fears, because he provides some incredibly relatable, visceral examples.
The first is the feel of abandonment. He shares a case study of a man he calls John. John's father abandoned the family at a very young age.
To cope with this deep childhood trauma, John developed a massive overcompensation mechanism. He built a stoic, tough, completely impenetrable exterior.
But underneath that armor, he was terrified of being left again, which meant he was emotionally isolated from his wife and his friends.
John's story is a classic illustration of how an unaddressed fear of abandonment actually creates a dependency on the very thing you fear.
Because he was terrified of people leaving, his entire tough facade was actually a performance designed to prevent rejection.
He was dependent on their external validation. To overcome this, Riker details John's highly practical, multi-step regimen. This wasn't about just talking through his feelings, it was about taking action to reprogram his nervous system.
What were the actual steps he took?
First, he used structured daily affirmations to consciously decouple his self-worth from the opinions of others.
Second, he took up aggressive journaling to process his repressed emotions and track the behavioral patterns where his fear dictated his actions.
Third, he committed to intense, heavy physical exercise, weightlifting. And this wasn't just for aesthetics. It was for the mental clarity, the discipline, and the undeniable reality of physical progression.
Crucially, John sought out a mentor and joined a men's group.
Which forces him to expose himself to vulnerability in a safe environment.
Exactly. By exposing his flaws to other men who held him accountable without judging his fundamental worth, John built genuine self-sufficiency. He realized he could survive being seen.
The next fear is the fear of death. Now, on a surface level, we all know we're going to die, but Riker takes a deeply philosophical approach to this.
He moves past the physical fear and into the existential dread. He quotes the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who famously said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it."
He pairs Seneca's Stoicism with Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, which translates to the love of fate.
The idea here is profound. Confronting the absolute, unavoidable reality of your mortality shouldn't induce paralyzing dread. Instead, it should act as the ultimate clarifier.
It is the greatest motivator a man has. If you truly internalize that your time on this earth is finite and ticking down every second, you stop procrastinating.
You stop living according to other people's expectations. You live with intense, aggressive intention.
He illustrates this with a really powerful story about a man who survived a horrific car accident. The car is crushed, the man is trapped, and in the moment he genuinely believes he is taking his last breath. His overriding thought wasn't fear of the pain.
It was a crushing regret that he was living a life that wasn't true to himself.
He survived, and the very next day, he walked in and quit his soul-crushing, high-paying corporate job to start a nonprofit. The fear of death didn't break him, it actually set him free to live authentically.
It's interesting how John's fear of abandonment led to overcompensation. But there's a flip side to that coin. What happens when a man is so terrified of getting it wrong that he simply refuses to step onto the field?
That is the fear of failure, which Riker notes holds an untold number of men back from their true potential.
He points to historical titans. Thomas Edison, who endured 1,000 documented failed attempts before successfully inventing the incandescent light bulb.
And Michael Jordan, who was famously cut from his high school varsity basketball team.
The fear of failure is rarely about the failure itself. It is fundamentally tied to the fear of public judgment, humiliation, and the resulting loss of status.
Because men are biologically and culturally conditioned to believe their worth is tied entirely to their utility and success, failing feels like a death sentence to their identity.
To combat this paralysis, Riker advocates for specific psychological strategies. He discusses visualization.
The practice of mentally rehearsing both the process of success and the emotional regulation required during a failure, which reduces the physiological anxiety.
You have to reframe failure. It's not a reflection of your innate worth. It is simply an essential, unavoidable data point on the path to eventual success.
And he emphasizes that vulnerability is the prerequisite for courage. You cannot take a risk without making yourself vulnerable to failure. If you avoid vulnerability, you avoid growth.
Which bridges us perfectly into the final fear, the fear of intimacy.
This is where Riker provides the story of the man who could bench press 300 pounds.
He built a fortress, but he was starving to death inside of it.
It's a tragic and incredibly common metaphor for modern masculinity. Riker unpacks the paradox here. True, undeniable strength actually requires vulnerability.
Building emotional walls keeps you safe from getting hurt, yes, but it also completely blocks out the deep connection and intimacy that men desperately need to remain psychologically stable.
But dropping that armor causes literal panic in a lot of guys. How does he suggest they handle it?
Riker suggests practical, physiological tools to manage the intense anxiety that comes with emotional honesty. He highlights the 4-7-8 breathing method.
You inhale quietly through your nose for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 7 seconds, and exhale completely through your mouth for 8 seconds.
This isn't just a relaxation trick. It is a mechanical way to stimulate the vagus nerve and forcefully shift the nervous system out of the sympathetic fight or flight mode and into the parasympathetic rest and digest mode.
It allows a man to stay grounded, present, and calm during difficult, intimate conversations, rather than shutting down defensively or lashing out in anger.
So, assuming a man has done the work, he has confronted abandonment, death, failure, and intimacy. Riker says the slate is clean. Now he must consciously harness his core desires.
We are moving into Chapter 3, exploring the primal desires that drive men. And he starts with the desire for connection.
The data he brings to the table here is actually quite alarming.
It is nothing short of an epidemic. The book cites data showing that an astonishing 15% of men report having absolutely no close friends.
Yes.
0.
To put the scale of that shift in perspective, that number was only 3% in 1990. We are watching the real-time collapse of male social circles.
Compounding this isolation is data showing that the male suicide rate is nearly 4 times higher than the female rate.
Riker argues that the primal need for a tribe, a close-knit group of men working toward a shared goal, is a survival mechanism hardwired into male DNA.
The modern destruction of third spaces and the resulting isolation is literally killing men.
To solve this, Riker points to very specific models. He talks about organizations like Men's Sheds.
This is a movement that started in Australia and now has over 2,000 locations worldwide. It's a remarkably simple concept.
It's just a physical space where men gather, work on woodworking or metalworking projects, and talk shoulder to shoulder.
Because men often communicate better while engaged in a shared task, rather than sitting face to face in a therapist's office.
He also looks back at historical military brotherhoods. The Spartans, the Knights Templar. He sees them as the ultimate models for shared, purposeful connection built on absolute trust and loyalty.
From connection, we move to the desire for dominance and leadership. Now, the word dominance has a very negative connotation today, but Riker reclaims it.
He does, and he returns to the biological argument regarding testosterone to do so. Higher testosterone naturally drives the desire for dominance and hierarchy.
But Riker is extremely careful to draw a sharp, distinct line. between a leader and a tyrant. A true leader, in his framework, balances strength with modesty, competence, and a profound sense of service to those below him.
He uses George Washington as the archetype here.
Yes, Washington is the historical ideal of a leader who commanded immense unquestioned respect, but who was famously reluctant to seize absolute power, ultimately stepping down voluntarily.
He didn't demand respect through tyranny, he earned it through shared sacrifice and competence.
In stark contrast, Riker examines weak leadership using British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies toward Nazi Germany prior to World War II.
He uses Chamberlain to illustrate how weakness, indecision, and a fear of confrontation don't preserve peace. They actively invite chaos and destruction.
True male dominance is about taking the heavy responsibility of protecting others, not crushing them to inflate your own ego.
And that ties directly into the final desire, the desire for freedom and legacy. Riker warns that any form of dependency destroys a man's autonomy.
Whether you are dependent on a romantic partner for your emotional stability, a massive corporation for your paycheck, or the government for welfare, dependency is a chain.
You have to achieve self-reliance to be truly free. What do you do with that freedom once you have it? You build a legacy.
And legacy, he stresses, must be rooted in service, not ego. He cites massive historical philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, who built thousands of public libraries, and modern figures like Bill Gates.
True legacy isn't about dying with the most toys. It is about creating something that outlasts your physical body, something that continues to positively shape and organize the world long after you are gone.
For Riker, this is the ultimate, highest expression of the biological protector and provider instinct applied to the broader canvas of human society.
Now, we are entering what is undeniably the most controversial and highly debated part of the book. In Chapter 5, Riker explicitly goes on the offensive against the concept of equality.
He calls modern equality a myth and asserts that the feminist movement has morphed from a fight for legal rights into a cultural juggernaut that actively vilifies male nature.
This is a good moment to reiterate our stance for the listener. We are objectively analyzing Riker's text. This section contains his highly charged, direct critique of modern feminism and the fundamental concept of gender equality.
Riker's core argument in this chapter is that the modern push for absolute identical equality actually pits the genders against each other in a hostile zero-sum competition.
He argues it destroys what he calls complementarity. In his view, men and women evolved differently, specifically to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, forming a cohesive unit.
They were never meant to be identical, interchangeable economic units in the corporate workforce or within the home.
And he brings in some heavy neurological claims to support this idea that we aren't interchangeable. This isn't just about culture for him. He claims our brains are physically wired differently.
He points to various neuroimaging studies suggesting structural differences in male and female brains. To put it simply, the book asserts that male brains typically display more neural connections within individual hemispheres.
Think of the male brain, according to this text, like a series of highly specialized soundproof workshops. When a man is fixing a car or solving a math problem, he is only in the mechanic's shop. The rest of the building is quiet.
That's a great analogy. Those intrahemispheric connections optimize the male brain for localized focus, spatial reasoning, and highly compartmentalized problem solving. You focus on one target until it is destroyed or solved.
Female brains, the text claims, show significantly more connections between the two hemispheres.
So staying with the analogy, the female brain is described more like an open plan office where all departments, logic, emotion, memory, are constantly communicating with each other simultaneously.
Exactly. Which optimizes them for integrated thinking, rapid context switching, complex social empathy, and multitasking.
Riker uses this neurological framework to argue that our brains are literally physically wired to approach the world in fundamentally different ways. Therefore, treating men and women as completely identical and expecting identical outcomes across all fields is a denial of basic science.
He also brings in sociological data on family structures to argue that traditional roles are objectively better for society as a whole. He points to data from the Institute for Family Studies.
According to Riker's interpretation, that data claims that families adhering to traditional structures, specifically where the man acts as the primary economic provider and the woman acts as the primary nurturer and caregiver, exhibit higher median household incomes and significantly lower poverty rates compared to alternative structures.
He couples this economic data with psychological research indicating that children raised in homes with highly involved, traditionally authoritative fathers demonstrate higher IQs better emotional regulation, and fewer behavioral problems.
For Riker, this data isn't just trivia. It proves his point that the breakdown of traditional gender roles, spurred by the modern push for interchangeability and equality, has actively destabilized both the macroeconomic system and the micro-level family unit.
And he is incredibly critical of what he sees as a massive, blinding double standard in how modern culture addresses this.
He argues that the cultural hypocrisy is absolutely blatant. Women, he notes, are constantly celebrated. They are encouraged in movies, media, and corporate HR departments to display traits of fierce independence, assertiveness, and unapologetic strength.
They are told to lean in.
However, when men display those exact same traditional traits when they lean in, assert dominance, or demand traditional structures, they are immediately labeled as oppressive, domineering, or part of the toxic patriarchy.
He argues that this double standard proves the modern movement isn't actually about achieving a neutral equality. It's about elevating women while actively suppressing male nature.
Which leads us directly into Chapter 6, where Riker tackles the phrase that has defined the last decade of gender discourse: toxic masculinity.
He essentially calls the entire concept a misandrist myth designed to pathologize normal male behavior. Now, he doesn't deny that individual men can behave terribly, commit crimes, or be abusive, but he argues that labeling those behaviors as inherently masculine is a deliberate rhetorical trick.
To clarify his point, he draws a vital, nuanced distinction between unbridled aggression and controlled assertiveness. He uses a corporate example that many people can relate to. Think of the aggressive boss.
This is the guy who storms into meetings, yells at his subordinates, slams his fists on the table, and rules entirely by fear.
That man might get short-term results, but he eventually alienates his entire team, destroys morale, and usually derails his own career.
And society looks at that guy and says, see, toxic masculinity.
Right, but Riker argues that man isn't displaying masculinity, he's displaying a lack of emotional control.
In contrast, Riker presents the assertive leader. This is the man who speaks calmly, sets incredibly firm expectations, holds people accountable, and stands his ground in a negotiation without ever resorting to an emotional outburst.
The assertive leader commands deep loyalty and respect. Riker's point is that modern society is deliberately blurring the lines between these two men.
Culture is labeling necessary, quiet male assertiveness as toxic aggression in order to keep men docile and compliant. True masculinity isn't toxic. It is the highly controlled, constructive application of strength.
So how does a modern man achieve this controlled strength? How does he become the assertive leader instead of the aggressive tyrant?
Riker introduces a concept he calls spiritual pragmatism. And this is fascinating because it's not about sitting on a mountaintop, burning incense, and chanting Om.
It's about the brutal, practical application of spiritual principles to become a more effective, dangerous man in the real world.
And to ground this philosophy, he introduces a highly specific, notoriously complex theoretical framework, the CTMU, or the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe.
Wait, hold on. The Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. That sounds like graduate-level quantum physics. Let's break that down. How does mathematical structure actually apply to a guy just trying to get his life together and be a better man?
It's a heavy concept. At its core, the CTMU is a theoretical framework that attempts to unify science and theology. It suggests that reality isn't just dead matter. It proposes that consciousness is a fundamental structural aspect of reality itself. It models the universe as a self-processing language.
Okay, so if the universe is a language, where does masculinity fit into the grammar?
In Riker's specific context, he uses the CTMU to argue for a purely rational, logical approach to spirituality. If the universe has an underlying mathematical conscious order, then the divine masculine, the urge to build, protect, impose order, and define boundaries is actually perfectly aligned with the fundamental structure of the cosmos.
It gives men a logical, structural foundation for their spiritual practices, rather than asking them to rely on purely emotional or mystical faith. It frames masculine order as a cosmic necessity.
That is an incredibly dense, fascinating way to validate the male drive. But he also gives a very stern warning against a trap he calls spiritual bypassing. We all know that guy.
The guy who comes back from a weekend ayahuasca retreat talking about his aligned chakras and operating on a higher frequency, while his wife is miserable and his car is actively being repossessed in the driveway.
That is exactly what spiritual bypassing is. It is the act of using spiritual practices, meditation, or a focus on positive vibes as a shield to avoid dealing with real, messy, painful, real-world problems.
Riker warns that a man cannot use spirituality to hide from a failing marriage, a toxic job, or financial ruin.
Spiritual pragmatism means using your meditation or your inner peace to gain clarity and then turning around and aggressively tackling your real world problems with that new focus. You don't retreat from the physical world, you conquer it more effectively.
That brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most politically charged and actionable part of the deep dive. Chapter 12 focuses entirely on men's rights, massive societal structures, and the concrete actionable steps men must take in a system that Riker claims is heavily structurally biased against them.
Let's look at the systemic failures he outlines. We have to start with family court because this is ground zero for the men's rights movement.
Riker highlights a devastating statistic, claiming that in the United States, mothers are awarded sole or primary physical custody in approximately 80% of all divorce cases.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here because the standard societal defense of that statistic is that mothers get custody simply because they are traditionally the primary caregivers prior to the divorce. Does Riker address that?
He does, and he rejects the premise that this justifies the disparity. He argues that this overwhelming statistical bias is a systemic failure that actively harms fathers by legally and financially disenfranchising them from their own children's lives.
Furthermore, he argues it fundamentally harms the children by depriving them of necessary daily male guidance and authority.
He ties this directly back to the data we discussed earlier regarding fatherlessness, higher crime rates, and lower IQs. He views the family court system as an institution that views men merely as disposable wallets.
Then there is the education system, which we touched on earlier regarding the pathologizing of boyish behavior. But the macro outcomes of that system are incredibly stark.
Pointing to national education data, Riker notes that women now earn roughly 57% of all bachelor's degrees. Men are dropping out of higher education at unprecedented rates.
When you combine this with the data showing boys are vastly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, suspended, or medicated, Riker frames a chilling conclusion.
He states this is not a case of boys failing to adapt to a fair system. This is a system that was intentionally redesigned to favor female learning styles, actively failing boys by treating their natural energy as a defect.
Finally, he addresses the Me Too movement. Now, he does acknowledge that addressing genuine sexual harassment and assault in the workplace is important, but his focus is heavily on the structural danger it poses to the protection of men.
He explores Riker's argument regarding the breakdown of Blackstone's ratio. That is the foundational legal principle that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer.
Riker argues that the Me Too movement has inverted this. It has created a cultural environment where a man's life, career, and legacy can be utterly destroyed overnight by a single, unproven accusation.
He asserts that the erosion of due process, the public presumption of guilt, and the complicity of corporate HR departments disproportionately target and terrify men, creating a culture of systemic unfairness.
So, after laying out this entire massive framework, the historical archetypes, the internal fears, the biological desires, the critique of the equality myth, the defense against toxic masculinity, and the breakdown of systemic failures, what is Riker's ultimate call to action? What is a man actually supposed to do tomorrow morning?
The call to action is multi-pronged, uncompromising, and demands intense personal responsibility. First, he advocates for the deliberate, unapologetic rebuilding of physical, male-only spaces. Men must forge brotherhoods away from the scrutiny and policing of modern culture.
Second, he urges men to actively demand and organize for aggressive legal reforms, particularly focusing on presumption of shared parenting in family court and protections in education.
And on a personal level,
Third, he stresses the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of maintaining financial independence. In Riker's view, economic leverage is the only real way to ensure personal autonomy in a hostile culture.
if you rely on the corporate system, they can cancel you. If you own your own business, you are insulated.
Finally, he advocates for a total return to classical, virtue-focused education. He wants men to actively reject feelings-based, modern curricula. Instead, men should study formal logic, military history, and classical philosophy to build the intellectual resilience required to defend themselves against ideological capture.
It is a comprehensive, intensely demanding, and highly provocative roadmap for the modern man.
If you have found this deep dive into the red-pilled perspective, biological determinism, and the history of our institutions illuminating, I strongly encourage you to buy the ebook to get the full, uncensored experience directly from the source.
Search for Masculine Enlightenment, Fear, Desire, and Spiritual Awakening by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now.
And don't forget to follow at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing essays and insights. Also, please take a moment right now to like and subscribe to our channel. It tells us that you want us to keep diving deep into these complex requested topics.
And as we conclude this extensive analysis, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought extrapolated from Riker's text to mull over on your own. If, as Riker argues, the entirety of human civilization is a physical structure built upon the biological imperatives of male protection, provision, and institution building.
What happens to the physical and economic infrastructure of the modern world if men simply decide to stop participating in a system they feel actively despises them?
An incredibly heavy question to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly detailed journey today. We appreciate you, the listener, for trusting us to break down these complex, challenging, and vital topics. Until the next deep dive.